Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So really just on behalf of the Lennon Hall Library, I just want to welcome everybody here to the third installment of the LGBT History Club. The idea for this goes back many months. In fact, we had hoped to host these physically in the library building, but obviously that hasn't been possible. But we are becoming more used to the Zoom format, as much as I actually really don't enjoy it whatsoever. But yeah, we were just listening to some music there. She moved by the fair, and it just occurred, or she moved through the fair. It just occurred to me that Joseph Campbell had wrote the words to those. Joseph Campbell actually had applied once for a job in the Lennon Hall Library and didn't get it way back in the early 20th century. So just a little Lennon Hall Library connection to the session tonight already. Your speaker tonight is Jeff Dudgeon. I met Jeff in a previous life when I worked at the Northern Ireland Assembly. Although he probably can't remember it, but I do remember it, and I remember the first conversation that we ever had was about Roger Casement. In fact, so it's funny how these things come full circle. Now that I'm working in the Lennon Hall Library, our paths have crossed from time to time, not least because Jeff Dudgeon has his own archive, really, in the Lennon Hall Library's collection, and I think these events are important for the library to advertise what we have, not least, as I say, the Jeff Dudgeon archive. So if there's any researchers out there, anybody who has an interest in this topic or an interest in any of the campaigns that Jeff has been involved in the past, please do get in touch with the library. We'd be more than happy to facilitate that. Richard has already mentioned that tonight's being recorded. It's being recorded in the hope that it will be placed on YouTube and will go out via our social media channels, both through the Lennon Hall Library, but also through the LGBT Heritage Project, which Richard looks after. So I would encourage you to go on to the Lennon Hall's YouTube channel and subscribe, and you'll see a whole back catalogue there really of talks which we've been putting out since the beginning of lockdown way back in March, including the previous two meetings of the LGBT History Club. So I'm looking forward to tonight's session. And as I say, if anybody is aware of anyone else who wasn't able to make it tonight, do tell them to tune in to our YouTube channel in the next day or so, and they'll be able to catch up on this and enjoy Jeff's fabulous talk for us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Jeff, while I'm introducing you, you could start putting up your PowerPoint. I'd like to say that Jeff is making his debut on Zoom tonight, so we're very pleased that he's chosen the LGBT History Club to do so. Jeff Dudgeon was the plaintiff at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg in a 6-year case whose 1981 judgment relating to the private life of male homosexuals in Northern Ireland led to the decriminalisation of same-sex relations in 1982. Jeff is the author of 2 books on Roger Casement, a biography with the Diaries in 2002, including the never-before-published erotic 1911 diary, and I have here my own copy of said book by Jeff with the never-before-published erotic 1911 diary. And then Jeff also published Casement's German diary, which he did in 2016. Apart from being LGBT pioneer, Jeff later in his life was elected as an Ulster Unionist councillor to Belfast City Council, where he served for the Balmoral district from 2014 to 2019. Now, Jeff, I am waiting for you to go to the bottom of the screen where you see the green share screen. Hit on that, which will take you...
Yeah, just having a wee bit of difficulty finding it again.
Okay, the very bottom of the screen. If you bring your cursor down to the very bottom, you'll see a green symbol saying share screen. Click on that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Should be coming up now.
That's it.
Got it. Yep, we're going. Well, I'll start away then, Richard.
Yeah, just go to the slideshow and go to the from the beginning.
Okay. Right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the talk I'm about to give you. It is slideshow hinged, the actual word, so take account of that. My thanks go to Richard for bearing with me in all the training sessions.
Not all, if you just go to take a cursor to slideshow and then move it to the left of your screen where it says from beginning, and if you click on that, we'll just get the main slide rather than the other stuff. So hit from the beginning.
Yeah, it's moved forward of its own accord.
No, whenever you want to change a slide, you'll have to just hit the down arrow. But we've got the main cover slide. That's perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks then to Richard and to Tom Hume, who also was a valuable assistant, and to Jason for putting the overall set of lectures together, which is great, and for his kind words earlier. If you see there from the title, Roger Casement, Ulster Gay, it has also a subtitle, which is quite a long and complicated one, but we'll come to the researching and the writing at a later point. But just talking briefly about the title, was he an Ulster Gay? There's three questions in that, really. Was he from Ulster? Was he gay? And was he an Ulster Gay? Strictly speaking, he wasn't an Ulster man. He was born in Dublin. I don't think he lived there very long. He was brought up largely in the south of England until the age of about 12 or 13. He was orphaned. Well, his mother died first. And then his father brought him to Ballymena at about the age of 12, where he had, actually his early connections were more with Ballymena than with Ballycastle, though he effectively adopted Ballycastle as his home after he left Ireland, essentially, and he used to come back frequently. So by my reading, in some senses, he wasn't really an Ulsterman. He was London Irish, actually more in his accent betrayed that in many ways. But like many people on the margins of political life in particular, he adopted the nationalism of the centre, you could say. I was going to suggest several characters' names, but I think maybe it's inappropriate. But I'll just mention one, which was Napoleon, obviously born in Corsica. So was he gay, or was he straight, or was he nothing at all? I'm going to leave that to later, but I think you know the answer I'm going to give. Essentially, very few people are nothing at all. In fact, I don't know of anyone in that category, but maybe I'll find them. So we come now to the book, which, as you see, also has a subtitle there with a study of his background, sexuality, and Irish political life. So it's actually quite an extensive volume. Sorry, it's going up and down. The title tells you everything, and it also tells you what it's not covered by and large. I didn't dwell at length on his time in Africa or South America. Others have dealt with that. Seamus O'Sheacon did the book on the Congo, using both his diary and the Congo report. So I don't assess those at length. Germany, as Richard mentioned, is dealt with in a separate book, which is largely his writings of the time. Doesn't have many notations and references as this one does, which is now in its third edition and is available on Amazon. It's also 800 pages, but you can read, don't have to read it all at one go. You can do it chapter by chapter. So the Casement documentation is enormous. I mean, it's literally, I don't think anyone wrote more than he did. So in his diaries, he mentioned even writing 50 letters in a single day, because he was a campaigner, a very assiduous, industrious campaigner, and as well a huge correspondent with a host of people of, most of them, or many of them, of significance who became significant over the years he was writing and corresponding. So it took me 5 years to complete that book, in some 2 years almost full-time researching a lot of it in the National Library in Dublin, which is a great place in the manuscript room to operate. And then maybe 3 years part-time writing it and putting it together and getting it published. So that's really a background. Richard actually asked me, I forgot to do a potted history of Casement for anyone who doesn't even know who he is. I've got a 10-second one here, which is that he was a consular official in Africa and later in Peru and Brazil and South America. And in both cases, he was asked by the London government to do inquiries into basically humanitarian issues, which became quite significant. And he got knighted in 1912, I think, as a result. And he was effectively a sort of advanced liberal of that category in his time. But his Irish nationalism, which has been there from his teenage years, accelerated over that 10 years before 1916. He became involved heavily in the Belfast movement, and later then in Dublin in the Volunteers, and then in the importation of arms in 1914, and he moved to Dublin, to Germany in 1914, and basically took up the German side on behalf of Ireland, and came back obviously in a submarine in 1916 and was captured and hanged for treason. And his diaries then became significant because they were discovered. And he became a controversial figure, as much for the diaries as for his other activities. But obviously he had a multifaceted career. He started life, as I mentioned, largely in London, but he was a teenage nationalist, which is quite significant because he didn't come from a nationalist family. His father was a British Army captain at one point. He retired early, was somewhat disgruntled and unhappy in his life. His mother was a Dublin Protestant, though she later converted to Roman Catholicism quite late on, when Casement was about 3 or 4 years old. The reasons for that are a bit obscure, but she came from I would think, a sort of advanced, almost feminist for its time family. Her own mother was a school teacher of girls in the 1830s and 40s. So that could tell you something. So he had the two parents, and he lived in London, and a rackety life with the father and mother. There was no money. The father had to rely on loans and grants from the family back in Ballymena and Ballycastle. And the family was quite wealthy in some respects. The sort of founder of the family was a solicitor who worked for Lord Mazarine in Antrim town. Lord Mazarine was a rather peculiar gentleman who was actually imprisoned in the Bastille, and I rather suspect a lot of people made off with a lot of his money while he was absent for 10 or 12 years. But he was freed when the French Revolution came and reappeared, and Casement's great-grandfather, solicitor, I think, parted company at that point, but he bought land in Ballycastle. The digitization of newspapers, which is now rampant, really, is one way of finding out a lot of facts about individuals who weren't previously known, and things do turn up. And I just came across one in particular which tells you something about the family background in Casement. That he and his brother, he had two brothers, were in court in London in about 1870 for stealing books. Rather typical Casement, it had to be books, and the father had to give evidence and say that it was all a terrible mistake. But I think it told you that he had an unsettled family background in London. When his mother died, she died in Worthing, and the family weren't living in Worthing, so I rather think they had parted company. He came to Ballymena with the father, who proceeded to die fairly rapidly from TB in the Adair Arms in that town, and he was left basically under the guardianship of a squad of relatives, both in Ballymena and Ballycastle. There's good, very interesting stories in relation to all that. And Hugh Casement, who's one of the family from Macron Temple, has shown me a lot of, or allowed me to publish a lot of the letters of the time where they were discussing what to do with him. But essentially, they decided they hadn't the money to send him to university, and he was going to have to go into commerce or join the police or emigrate to Canada. And in the end, he moved to Liverpool at the age of 15. He left school from what became Ballymena Academy. Effectively, he was educated, I would detect, to a graduate level. Even at the age of 15, he could speak French, and he could argue and discuss many issues. So he's either very bright or very well educated, or both. He moved to Liverpool to his mother's sister's home, the Bannisters. And his father worked in the shipping trade in Africa and got him into a company called Elder Dempster, and he worked for several years plying the Atlantic as a purser on Elder Dempster vessels. His uncle Edward actually was almost a mirror image of Casement, or maybe it's the other way around. Though oddly, Casement almost never refers to the uncle, but everything the uncle did, Casement did, and sometimes only a few years later, because the uncle eventually entered the consular service and became a consul in Congo, was effectively expelled from the Congo because he took up the cases of Africans, British Africans from West Africa, who were being exploited and injured and hurt. And unlike Casement, he didn't prosper, though he did end up, as a sort of kindness, they gave him a consular position in Brazil, which is exactly where Casement went after his Congo experience. But as I say, Africa was a complicated issue. Just to remind you here, here's a little picture, courtesy of Dan Gilmore, who gave me a copy of it from the National Library, and it's Casement's self-portrait as a wood kern. The thing jumps forward. And I think that tells you a lot about his outlook as a teenager, that his idealism and his romantic views were Irish nationalist, were all around him, were people largely of a unionist outlook in the big families he knew and mixed with, except for the women of the Glens, the Protestant women of the Glens, Rose Young, her sister, Margaret Dobbs, Ada McNeil, were an odd, in the sense of political mixture. They were unionist in the day and nationalist at night, you could almost say, because they ran the two lives almost on top of each other. But they were significant nationalists into the Irish language movement, and obviously the Glens. The Glens Fèis was one of their big operations where Casement was involved in it. The crew of people he was involved with when he came back from the Congo from sort of 1904 to 1912 included people like Francis Joseph Bigger, who operated from the big house on the Antrim Road, Ardree, Herbert Hughes, whom I mentioned, and the whole squad of Dennis McCulloch, who later became head of the IRB. So I have a chapter really on that era, which was actually heavily praised by Eamon Phoenix, I have to say, which rather pleased me, which explains how basically Irish nationalism was seeded in Belfast, or the modern version, you could say, but by these characters, including Bulmer Hobson, another individual of significance. But essentially from about 1911-12, the whole focus moved to Dublin, and Belfast ceased to be significant, but the individuals were significant. Just a piece of evidence about him: was he gay, was he not? He wrote in his diary in 1911, but he was harking back, he was visiting Ballymena. I'll just quote a couple of lines. This was him looking back to a time when he was 15 or 16. Glorious day, to Ballymena domain, was very hot indeed. To old Turnpool by Braid and Devon Burn of 1877, 3 exclamation marks, rippling in brown and swift. And there too, when I plunged across in March 1879, glorious boys of Erin, big and fair. And I think it tells you that he was not only had the memories of youthful swimming in rivers in the hot days, but he also had the memories of the boys he was with, and I suspect that was at the time he had the impression of or intentions and desires, because the one thing you can say about Casement is that he was never unconfident about being gay. He was entirely self-assured, though at the same time he didn't link the gay side of his life with his political or family or other parts of his life, but we could come to that later. So this is just a picture of Casement age 26, when he was already working on the Congo or in Africa. It's about one of the few pictures of Casement where he's actually almost cheerful. He's got a ghost of a smile there. And the next picture is an African picture. He had a complicated career in Africa. I'm not going to go into it, but he served in. You're getting a preview each time. He served in Mozambique during the South African War and helped out against the Boers. He also served in Angola. He started off his career in Africa working in Nigeria and the Congo before that. But it was in Nigeria that he came to the attention of the British consular people, and he got a job as a sort of an assistant consul in Nigeria. And he tells some pretty hair-raising tales of his activities there, including having to deal with the burning of servants or slaves after their master died, and tried to stamp out some of these traditions. But he was a great believer in the 3 C's, as he said at the time: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. And that was the sort of, if you want to call it imperialist, but the attitude of the time to justify being in Africa. And there was a significant amount of effort put into the commerce, which he himself did. He was involved in the railways, bringing the railways into the Congo before he took up his consular job. This guy, Fritz Pincus, was a Jewish man in Mozambique, German, whom Casement defended at later points because he was accused of being effectively pro-German spy during the South African War, and Casement said he was entirely innocent of any such action. And he took up the case very heavily. It shows he was only a low-level consular official, but he took it up with the very senior people in the Foreign Office. So he was very loyal in that sense to some of his friends. And next one is just going back to Herbert Hughes, the musician, who is the guy on the left. And it's a rather delightful picture, I think, of him rubbing gravestones with Frank Bigger presumably in Belfast somewhere. There's a Celtic cross on the thing behind us. It might not be Belfast, it might be, but it looks a very ancient graveyard. And Hughes was basically Frank Bigger, is an interesting character in himself, ran a sort of university of archaeology and nationalism and music at his big house in Ardrey, and whole squads of basically every significant person in the Easter Rising, bar Patrick Pearse, would visit and stay and attend the events at Ardrey. Then moving on, we come to the diaries, just for your own delectation. This is a front copy of the 1910 diary. As you will all know, the authenticity dispute continues, and it's as strong and as fierce as ever. So I won't go into where we are in it, but essentially it remains an article of belief, I think, that for people, either the diaries were forged by the British or they weren't. And people where belief is concerned and faith, you can't argue, you can't convince people either way. Usually they just continue with their views. But I have a very long chapter, 100 pages on both on the authenticity, well, chapters, and on Casement's homosexuality. And the evidence for his homosexuality is the diaries, which obviously creates issues if people believe they're forged. But there is huge amount of inferences in Casement's other correspondence and what people said and thought about him that tell you that he was gay. But nothing, there's no smoking gun outside the diaries, but then the diaries are colossal evidence if you accept them, and even nobody in their right mind would forge hundreds and hundreds of pages of details. 80% of it minor issues about the weather and what vegetation he saw along the way, and then 15% maybe had a sexual aspect. But they were quite numerous. Nobody else actually of that era wrote so vividly and so significantly about being gay. And so for that reason at all, forgetting all the Irish issues, they are a huge example of what went on in the gay world historically, which there's very little other evidence until about the 1930s or 40s really of it even existing. Just a small point, but Gavin Duffy, his solicitor, destroyed looked over 3 suitcases of letters somebody sent to or took to him in 1915. And I think many of those letters which have disappeared, and I assume were destroyed by Gavin Duffy, were boyfriend letters and other revealing letters, but they also were a considerable number of his correspondence, people he wrote to hundreds of times, all their incoming letters disappeared. There's a big gap in the archive for about 10 people. I think of just this one moment, I'll quote a line or two from his poetry, and I think the poetry tells you quite a lot. And this is a line saying, "O God of love, how can it be accursed, this love that wakes, that thrills me through the night, this love that fills my being with delight, of all the ills that stamp man's lot the worst." He then crossed out, "Why were we given hearts to pant and thrill, and eyes to blaze and soften at a touch?" Well, I don't think you can have much doubt that this is, he's talking of an accursed love which is consuming him, and you'd have to be slightly naive to think it was other than his homosexuality. But he cruised, and he was a classic gay man of the 1960s and 70s in that sense. In cruising, he cruised every city in Atlantic port, Dublin, London, Belfast, and there's many references to all that. But there's also an issue about the age of the boys concerned in many cases. This is a picture of a boy in Barbados whom he met, who was about 16, I think, at the time, maybe younger. Oddly, I got this photograph from a relative of Teddy Biddy, who became an American citizen in the end. The relative, who I think was a great nephew or a great nephew, he gave me a very interesting story about Teddy and the whole family of Biddies, who Casement rather unpleasantly, I think, categorized them as poor whites who were nagging him all the time. But they were basically, I think, a family that had gone down in life, and they eventually all migrated to Connecticut. And sadly, Teddy, who this relative thinks was gay, was joined the US Army in 1917 and died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So we never know much more about that. So we have him now in South America, and this is quite an interesting picture, I think, of the man himself. Hard to know what book he's reading, but you can almost read the On the Spine. Begins with S, the book, and then we have his work in Peru. He was a consul in various places in. This thing has got a life of its own. It rushes forward. He was a consul in 3 or 4 cities in Para, in Santos, and lastly in Rio de Janeiro, where he was advanced to consul general. He didn't like Brazil, I think largely because he wanted to be at home in Ireland where things were happening, and he was involved in the Irish separatist movement even from a distance, and he came home at least once a year and got heavily involved. But again, because of his first investigation in the Congo, he was asked to do one in Peru, where a British rubber company was, there had been questions about how it was operating there and what was happening to the Indians of the Amazonian Indians, who were actually treated much worse than the Congolese. They were almost casually murdered, it was quite gross what went on. And so this is typical of Casement. He didn't just do his investigation and come back with a report. He actually campaigned on the report, maybe over and above his place, but he was allowed to, because the Liberal government at the time was sympathetic to his outlook and views. Anyway, he brought these two Indian boys back to England, as some say it was a bit tasteless the way he did it, but it was part of his campaigning. He tried to get the younger boy enrolled in Patrick Pearse's school, St. Enda's, and Pearse agreed. But for some reason, they basically returned to South America. And I did a little chapter. It was quite an interesting story about them. The older boy was married and had kids, I think. Anyway, they wanted to go back, according to the British consul in Iquitos in Peru, said they wanted to go back to the jungle. And they had a problem. They couldn't go on the ships up the River Amazon because they were Indians and they weren't allowed to travel. So somehow or other, the older boy, Rakudo, stowed away and got back, and Amarino, the younger one, followed him. And so that was the last we've heard of them. But they're painted there by Sir William Rothenstein. I think that's a delightful picture of that era. And the older boy Casement took photographs of him as well in situ, and he quite enjoyed dressing in the sort of upstream Indian outfits with the feathers and the teeth. I don't know what the teeth are, jaguar or something. Then we come to the whole squad of photographs, which again are somewhat revealing. He took in Peru. He was stuck in Iquitos, which is a sort of river town in Peru. It's actually, you can only reach by river. There's no roads to it, which is a rubber town. It was sort of frontier town in that respect. Right, Brian, listen carefully. And this is one of the guys, I think you could almost say he groomed Jose Gonzalez, but he was one of half a dozen he photographed and basically took out swimming and that sort of thing. The odd thing is that these photographs survived, and we went to Scotland Yard, who seized them in 1916. They were returned to Casement's cousin Gertrude. She in turn sent them in the 1930s to the National Library in Dublin, and she didn't realize or notice that there was something untoward about them, or the modern eye would certainly think so. But the odd thing is, some photographs, because she got a squad of photographs in frames and albums, probably more historic ones than personal, but they disappeared entirely, unsadly. So we're moving on. Another couple of youths, which I think is rather indicative. He's met them obviously on a seafront somewhere, and they're fairly self-assured. But he liked the look of them, and I suspect they answered back. There's another youth from 1911 who also from the Amazon. But the thing that you have to say about, and people have argued, was Casement guilty of underage activity. Well, there was no age of consent in those days. Everything was criminalized. There's no indication that he exploited any of the native peoples he met in the Congo or in Peru. The people he met up with and to some extent groomed, or at least befriended, were Europeanized urban individuals for the most part, and the diaries never record any untoward or anger from those people. Rather the opposite. They would quite often come back for more, and whatever it was happening. So the Peruvian, he had to go twice. He returned in 1911 to Iquitos in another pointless revisiting, but the report came out eventually in 1912. But again, it was power politics was involved, because you had Peru, United States didn't like Britain interfering with the Monroe Doctrine in South America, and Colombia had a frontier dispute with Peru over the whole thing. So it was never easy. You couldn't, and that's true of all politics. You can do humanitarian work, but you can't just announce something has to be done and leave it. It's a struggle every inch of the way, and you fail or you win, particularly whether or not you're political. And he was political, and that was what he brought to the Irish Volunteers. And when he retired on grounds of mental health in 1912, and this rather fine painting, which is in Dublin now, National Gallery, was by Sarah Persa, was a significant woman artist, obviously, of the era, and it's a fine portrait of a fine-looking man. But by then, without going into any detail, he was part of the creation of the Irish Volunteers, which were a response to some degree to the Ulster Volunteers. In 1914, they were armed. He was the treasurer of the Volunteers and was assisted in the process of bringing arms in from Germany in 1914. But by that time, he was actually on a visit to the United States when it came in, and the United States, where he got to know John Devoy and Joseph McGarrity, who were very big players in the 1916 Rising. But there was a dispute in Dublin at this moment between, you might call them moderates in the Irish Volunteers and the inner circle or of the group in charge of the Easter Rising, effectively Tom Clark and Sean McDermott. And Casement had compromised with John Redmond, as did Bulmer Hobson. And there was the seeds of what became a big dispute. But Casement was granted a pardon to some degree because he brought the guns in 1914, whereas Bulmer Hobson suffered politically in 1916 when he opposed the Rising, as did another Northerner, Owen McNeill. So I've now moved on, and I suppose time's also moving on. He was in Germany from 1914 to 16. He brought with him this guy, Adler Christensen, who betrayed him, though he could never grasp or believe that he was being betrayed by Adler, even though he knew he was a crook. And everyone, John Devoy in New York, kept advising him, don't trust Adler, he's a crook. And it gave him chapter and verse and all the crookedness about it. And he didn't believe it in many respects. Adler, as soon as they landed in Norway on the way to Germany, went straight to the British legation and offered to betray Casement, but changed his mind, which is a very complicated story. But in 1916, he went back to the British consulate in Philadelphia, again offered to betray Casement, and again changed his mind at the last minute. But I've actually been, Adler I think was a sociopath. I've been contacted by two of Adler's descendants. He had 3 wives, at least. One lives in America, one lives in Canada. And there's a guy called Bjorn Godoy, who's a Norwegian, who's written a book on Adler, which is, sadly for me anyway, written in Norwegian. But I've been to see Bjorn in Oslo, and he told me many important things. Adler, nobody initially knew whatever happened to Adler, but he died in a Paris jail in 1935. He had a career as a burglar and other activities. I think things went downhill. After his 3rd wife, he abandoned her in the opium dens of Vancouver, his relative told me. So we come now, pretty well, we're coming up to the end, you'll be pleased to know. And this is a key photograph of Casement without a beard, with 2 of the men he brought back from Germany. On the left, Monteith, and on the right, second in from the right was like camp was a guy called Bailey or Beverly, who was effectively was an ex-British soldier who was charged with Casement with treason, but in the end, the authorities in London dropped the charges against him, and he went back into the army. All the people involved with Casement around this time were a bit mysterious. Bailey, Monteith, a guy he sent called John McGoey, to. At this point, Casement had felt the Germans were useless. They were not going to provide the arms or the individuals necessary, and they had, even though he had diplomatic successes in getting Germany to recognise an independent Ireland, which I think was quite significant. First guy since Wolfe Tone who'd done so well in that respect. Anyway, McGoey was sent to try and stop the rising. McGoey disappears, and but just in recent years, one has been able to find out that he returned some. Instead of going to Dublin to tell them to call off the rising, he went to London, married a woman, and joined the British Army, and eventually ended up in Canada. So Casement was not very lucky in the people he gathered around him, you could say. But had McGoey stopped the Easter Rising, history would have been changed entirely. So I think, without going into huge detail about anything, and that leaves you the chance of buying the books instead of listening to me, and my voice is giving up. So I'm just finishing up with the last picture of me with Nobel Prize winner Mario Vargas Llosa in the city, Belfast, who wrote a novel called Dream of the Celt, which deals with a lot of those issues. So I'm now calling down, stopping the sharing, and I'm coming back in. Richard, over to you. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was fascinating. I learned lots, and I think we'll show our appreciation by a virtual round of applause.
Oh, penguins.
You can use your reaction button at the bottom to show a pair of yellow hands. There we are. Yeah, there we are. Great. Now, what I recommend is that if you have a question, you can go to the chat box and type in the question. And that is one way of conveying it to Jeff. Alternatively, because there's more than one screen, I won't be able to see you. But while we're waiting for a question to come through, if you want to wave your hand, so you need to put on your video, and unmute yourself if you want to ask a question while we're waiting for any to come through on chat, I'll be able to take it. So sorry, Richard Kennedy would like to speak. Great, Richard, can you unmute yourself and speak, please?
I am unmuted, Richard.
Fire away with your question, or?
Well, first of all, many thanks to Jeff for a fascinating insight into Casement. I have read bits of his book, but not all of it, and he certainly added to it, and I very much appreciated, even with his laryngitis, his presentation. So thank you for that, Jeff. What I wanted to ask was, I mean, I know from my own reading that Casement met Joseph Conrad on one of his trips. I think it was in Indonesia. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But I wondered if he met other, Conrad wasn't gay, but other gay people during his period in London, like Oscar Wilde, or whether he knew about Oscar Wilde and what Oscar was up to and so on. So do you know anything about that, Jeff?
Yeah, well, he actually met Conrad in the Congo. Both of them worked together on the ivory collection expedition, and Conrad was a river pilot, and they actually shared a billet together. Conrad has several memorable descriptions of Casement, not entirely flattering, though they were written to some degree after the 1916 Rising, when he opposed the Rising and wouldn't support the reprieve campaign for Casement. But a lot of people try to find out if Casement was was part of Heart of Darkness, and there may be a bit of him in there somewhere. Different people say different things. He knew a lot of literary figures over the years, and just one writer, Haggard, springs to mind. Others, but he didn't know Oscar Wilde. He certainly never mentioned him. In fact, the only two gay people that come in Hove interview are there's a guy called Lord, I've forgotten his second name, was it Beaumont or something? Important character in the Liberal government who was later exposed as gay and was about to be charged but fled to the United States. And he was the person who, whenever this was brought to the attention of the King, George V said, "I thought men like that shot themselves," was his response. But he didn't in the end do so, and eventually returned 20 years later. The one big character that crops up, though, is Edward Carpenter, who was the only out gay of the era, who was friendly with a guy called Sidney Parry, who eventually married Casement's cousin Gertrude. It's a complicated story, but I think Sidney Parry was gay. And one of the bits of evidence is a letter he wrote to Gertrude where he said, just be aware this will be a chaste marriage. But he was very sympathetic with Gertrude politically, and he met Casement through the rubber connection. He was a rubber planter in Malaya. And there's a diary mentioned by Edward Carpenter in 1915, before it was known or put about that Casement was gay. In fact, the British only discovered that he was gay, or took documentary evidence, in 1914, when Adler had gone to betray him. And Edward Carpenter wrote in his diary about discussing the matter with Sidney Parry, and he wrote this phrase, "homogenic?" ? So that's about the limit of those connections.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a great answer with loads of new information. I've got another question here from Mary Query. She asks, do you think Roger's politics, especially in relation to Irish politics, has prevented him from becoming a gay icon here? For example, there was no commemoration of him and his role in 2016.
It's a good question. I don't think you could call him I don't think he could ever really be a gay icon, because he never took up the issue. He lived a gay life very openly, well, not openly, very coherently, and he took up many issues. And he was quite a progressive man for his time on matters of race and empire and so on. But I think to be a gay icon, you have to have done something gay beyond have sex with people. So I don't think he would be. But I think it's interesting what happened in 2016, because it was a slightly delicate issue for the Irish government in particular, how to approach Casement. And they decided, rather than obviously take on the Diaries issue or anything like that head on, they slightly, I think, it was a bit of a trickery. They went off into the cultural end of things. So they did actually have a commemoration when the President Higgins spoke at Bannistrand in Kerry. So in that sense, he was treated as any one of the other executed men. But they also funded ballets and paintings and films, and they were put together by gay people. There's one in Dublin at the Hugh Lane Gallery, a film which imagined Casement and Adler living in semi-retirement in Oslo during the war, Second World War. So they diverted to some degree from the sexual or sexuality aspect into these cultural matters. You could say the same about the lesbian participants in the 16 Rising and the lead up, because they were discussed. Women's role was discussed heavily, but I think the lesbian involvement, which is really significant if you start peeling away the actuality. You find that people like Kathleen Lynn, Eva Gore-Booth, in case we knew Gore-Booth, and those women I mentioned earlier, Margaret Dobbs, who was, remained a hardline Republican until the 1950s, up in somewhere in the Glens, and despite her family owning the Castle Dobbs down the road somewhat in Larne. So yes, there's work to be done, and work has been done. I know Marie Mulholland's written about Lynn. That, in a sense, it was the lesbian aspect that almost disappeared in the centenary celebrations, commemorations.
Jeff, thanks again for that response. And I should say that that's an issue, the lesbian involvement in the nationalist movement, that I hope that we will return to in a later talk in this series. There's great work done, for example, by Mary McAuliffe at UCD, if anyone can't wait until we return to it ourselves. If anyone else has a question,
Colin
you
Kerr.
can unmute yourself and speak, because I'm on speaker view, so I can't actually see the full panel. So
right. I've unmuted Richard. Thanks. I can't see anything to type a question. Hi, Jeff. Nice to see you. Thanks very much for the talk. Great. I think I did read through your entire book when it came, and very fascinating, so many aspects. But one thing that does come out of your talk that, in a way, I didn't feel quite so much from the book. Your talk presents him as a person, but I get the feeling that perhaps he wasn't the best judge of character, and perhaps that also connects with his inability to be sure-footed in the political world.
Well, I think you'd be right in saying that, Colin, and good to see you as well. I mentioned Adler was obviously a bad choice, but he was easily taken in by young men. Is one way of looking at it. He had other difficult relationships with young men. He tended to offer them a chance of a future with him, and then things obviously tended to go wrong. There was a guy called Avellino who ended up in the British consulate in Rio, and Casement's successor was somewhat pissed off with having to deal with Avellino, who was hanging around. He was supposed to be a clerical assistant of some sort, and apparently did very little. And the replacement consul was trying to dump him and try to get Casement to pay for his passage back to Portugal. So I think that could be, in a way, just thinking as you speak, thinking about it, it could be a measure of the fact that he had no gay companions. He had nobody he communicated with, nobody who could advise him in these areas. And so he was just susceptible to notions about young men who attracted him, and he hadn't the wit to spot that there was obviously commercial aspects to many of them, and also many of them were people who had difficult existences and were dependent on his generosity, and but also were had eyes for the main chance, like Adler, who was he betrayed him twice and then failed to betray him both times. So he had a complicated mode of life, Adler. But as I mentioned, Bjorn discovered quite seriously significant stories about his upbringing in Oslo, and he'd been in reform school. He'd fallen out with his parents. They'd been, I think, Jehovah's Witnesses, which he didn't warm to. So, but scratch anyone and you'll find the most interesting stories.
Thanks. Very interesting.
Jeff, I have
another Jeff. Thank you.
Question here. It's from Dwayne Fitzsimons, who writes in the chat box. And by the way, if you bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little square with your chat on it. And if you click on that, that's where you can type in your questions. Dwayne asks, have you found any strange personal details about Casement's covert connections in his later years? I've heard that Francis Joseph Bigger loaned Casement's suit to Francis McPeak. McPeak had a tailor to fit. Casement was apparently tried in this suit, which was far too small for him.
I do know the suit does figure in some correspondence from Bigger to Casement's solicitor. Bigger, as I recall, he sent the suit to London because Casement had no clothes. He'd arrived, obviously, with nothing on the submarine except some prison garb. Presumably, he was what he'd arrived in, maybe prison garb, but he needed a suit for the trial, and I think that suit was. Bigger had it, his clothes at Ardrey. Later on, Bigger discovered or claimed, or his nephew, who was a senator in the Irish Senate, said they discovered papers of Casement, including a 1914 diary, which so horrified Bigger that he fainted. Now, I can't believe that, to be honest, because I think if Bigger wasn't gay, then nobody's gay. He was classic antiquarian. There's a poem, I think it's by Joseph Campbell or maybe Cathal O'Byrne, which you know, innocently says he was a mentor of boys, and so in that sense, if he fainted because he found a diary, well, to be honest, if he had 2 years to find the diary, I think he may well have found some things which he burnt. But I don't think he would have been as shocked by it. And there was a huge discussion in the 1930s, whenever the first book on Casement came out, that Bigger's nephew, Senator Bigger, told the authors, McCartan and Maloney, just to leave it be, just as De Valera had said, let's leave the issue out. Let Casement's, what was De Valera's phrase? Casement's reputation is fine and it's held within the Irish people, and we don't want to go down the avenues of his sexuality. Well, those are my words, not his. They tried to put the clampers on Senator Bigger for going around saying that he had discovered these diaries or had seen them, and some of the correspondence which in the National Library should have been destroyed, obviously, but wasn't. Says things like, well, we know what Bigger was. He was, in the parlance of the time, he was a friend, too friendly with Boy Scouts or something. But maybe he wasn't a sodomite or words that way. So there's a whole saga about the suit. It may, where it went after he was, he quite possibly was buried in it, to be honest. Which maybe now, he was a big man. He was 6'2" or 3". So if anyone was tailoring it to suit, I'm sure they'd be cutting it down. But it's amazing in those days, you forget, suits of clothes were never thrown out. They were handed to somebody else and sold. And clothes were so expensive that it was, nothing was ever destroyed. They were always used or reused.
Thank you very much, Jeff. If anyone else has a question, if you haven't put it into chat, you can just unmute yourself and speak out loud, please.
Richard, it's Richard Kennedy again. I wanted to ask, and it's slightly connected to the suit, that there has been, since Casement was executed, a whole debacle about the return of his body to Ireland. And the British government, as I understand, for many years refused to do that. Could Jeff tell us what the situation is now? Where is his body and what happened with all that?
Right. Well, his remains were brought back in 1965 and he was given a state funeral. De Valera attended in a snowstorm and he was pushing over 80. So the remains are at Glasnevin, and the deal with the British government, and it was Harold Wilson's government, was that the remains would not go north, which remains an outstanding issue for some people. There's a dispute even within republicanisms. One group says they would like the remains north now. There's a grave site in Murlough Bay, which Casement chose himself. Another faction would say he should not come north until partition ends. So I suspect he won't be coming north anyway for some considerable time. But it was a big issue for 40 years that his remains be brought home, and De Valera and others were campaigning for that pretty ceaselessly.
Well, it's obviously a political hot potato for the British, because as you just said, it was almost 50 years before his remains were returned.
Well, true, and obviously in 1965 the Unionist government was in charge in Stormont, and they had to do a deal with London, and the deal was that their remains don't come beyond Glasnevin, and there was a rather macabre discussion between civil servants of the time as to how they could ever prevent the remains coming north. Could they legislate to make it a criminal offence to bring him north? And a bill was even drafted, as I recall, to that effect. And then one civil servant wrote back saying, "Look, this is fine, this bill, but it doesn't cover all aspects. What happens if he was cremated and posted north?" And the whole thing collapsed in idiocy and was abandoned.
Thank you, lads. I'm going to move on to the next question. It's from Brian Gilmore, who asks, do you have any comments on Casement's trial?
Well, obviously, I didn't really deal with that. It was essentially it was an open and shut case. He accepted he committed treason, except he didn't commit treason because his loyalty was to Ireland, not to England, which remained the essence of the thing. There was a huge amount of activity during the trial. His solicitor, Gavin Duffy, later signed the treaty, became Minister of Foreign Affairs, and later still a judge. A very sort of sensible guy, operated a very tight policy during the trial, and no talk of diaries or homosexuality was permitted. He put a stop to anything like that because the newspapers were beginning to circulate with stories of depravity. His solicitor, he had a barrister called Sullivan, Alexander Sullivan, who was actually Gavin Duffy's brother-in-law, who was no lover of Casement, in fact, viciously opposed to separatism and republicanism, but he also had difficulties during the trial. He collapsed in the middle of it, and one of the junior counsel had to take over. He had two junior counsel, both were Welsh, oddly, Morgan, who was a sort of political historian, lawyer, and another one called Jones. But there was no question, he could not be found other than guilty for all the reasons. Though whether he was to be executed was a different issue. And had he was executed in August, tried, the trial ended and finished, and the appeal in July. Had the whole thing been spun out another couple of months, when the British government attitude to Ireland and the 16 Rising began to adjust and change, and they realized that things were never going to go back to 1915 again, he could perhaps have been reprieved, but they managed to dispose of him before that mood became noticeable in London anyway.
Thank you. I'm going to invite one last question. If anyone has one, just unmute yourself and speak.
Jeff, just on that question of the potential reprieve, in your book, and I'm wondering if there's real evidence for this or not, but the then Archbishop of Canterbury was on, as it were, he didn't want Casement to be executed, and he thought there should be clemency, and I believe he spoke in the House of Lords about that, and he was clearly putting pressure on the then government ministers. And I think it's in your book where it's stated that they silenced him by showing him the diaries, and he supposedly shut up and didn't say anything more about it. And so there was no high-level objection to the execution going ahead. Now, is that well enough documented, or is that sort of something else?
Randall Davidson was the guy's name. He didn't actually show, he carefully avoided seeing the diaries. He sent Sir John Harris, who was a Baptist missionary and who knew Casement in the Congo. He sent him into the Home Office to look at them. Harris came out shattered because he believed they were they couldn't have been by Casement. And then he read things about the Congo and people he knew there and things he'd seen, and he realized they were true. So in that sense, his Casement's chances were not improved, and the Home Office knew fine well what the result of that would be. The actual attempt to stop the execution, America could have been the place where it did happen. You know, London was desperate to keep the Americans on board and to bring them into the war. Woodrow Wilson was the president, and he relatively quietly just wouldn't take up the issue, even though there was the standard Senate resolutions and so on. But I think by that time, Casement there was a lot of German sabotage in New York in 1915-16, huge explosions on the railways and the docks. And by that time, Casement's name was associated with that because they had intercepted messages from Germany back to America. So I think it was for that reason in particular the Americans didn't come through with a reprieve campaign. Otherwise, I think they might have. Randall Davidson, the Archbishop, it's quite interesting. He didn't give up just because the diaries had surfaced. And he continued to put pressure on Downing Street for a reprieve. And he actually used the diaries in a slightly obtuse, perhaps you might say, an Anglican way. He said that the diaries proved that Casement was obviously insane because no sane man would go around writing down these things that he may or may not have done, and therefore they were about to execute a lunatic, and this was his last chance to try and avert the execution. So there were, I mean, quite significant numbers of people from the liberal end of things who were opposed to the execution, as well as the radical end and the Irish end, and the literary, significant number of literary people. I think I list them in the book. Who signed the obvious exception was Joseph Conrad.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And we'll stop the questions there. And I'm also going to stop the recording. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for a fascinating talk. We all learned a lot of new material from it, and also from your answers to the questions. They were a presentation themselves in terms of new information which you have shared and which we now have on record. So I think you can unmute yourselves if you like, and we'll give Jeff a virtual and audible round of applause. Thank you, Jeff.